If she'd just taken the bus like her mama asked, none of this would have happened. But 7-year-old Emily Carter liked her walks, especially the shortcut trail through the edge of Briar Hollow Woods. That morning, she'd packed her little purple lunchbox with peanut butter crackers and string cheese, tucked it into her pink backpack, and waved goodbye like she always did, smiling, ponytail bouncing, feet too small for the heavy sneakers she loved wearing anyway. That was 7:48 a.m. By 8:30, her teacher called the house. By 8:45, her mother was screaming in the street. By 9:15, every available officer in Cumberland County Sheriff's Department was out searching, and still as the golden sun turned pale and started its slide behind the pines, there was no sign of Emily. Not a footprint, not a dropped pencil, nothing. Deputy Rachel Monroe stood at the edge of the trailhead, her fingers tight around the leash of her K-9 partner Shadow, a large sable-coated German shepherd with intelligent, restless eyes. "This doesn't make sense," the sheriff muttered behind her. "It's a 5-minute walk to school. She's done it 100 times. Rachel nodded, but her focus was on Shadow. The dog was sniffing, pacing, then circling again, confused. The rain the night before had turned the earth to soft muck. If Emily had passed this way, any trace had been swallowed up. 12 hours, Rachel said quietly. "We're running out of time." People don't realize how fast the clock runs when a child disappears. There's an unspoken rule in law enforcement. The first 24 hours make or break the case, and with every passing minute, the odds of finding a missing child alive grow slimmer. But there was something different about Shadow. He was one of the best. In the past year alone, he'd helped recover a runaway teen hiding in a barn loft, found an Alzheimer's patient, lost 3 miles off trail, and even sniffed out a car key in a swamp. Shadow was steady, focused, a nose built for finding hope in places where none should remain. And yet, for the last hour, he'd only wandered ears, twitching tail low. Rachel could feel it through the leash. He was frustrated. So was she. The town of Brookvale had never seen something like this. Sure, they'd had break-ins, farm disputes, one scandal with a substitute teacher last year. But a child vanishing off a public trail. This kind of thing happened in cities. Not here. Volunteers showed up in waves. Neighbors, farmers, retired veterans. Kids passed out flyers. The mayor brought coffee and muffins to the command post, like that would make a difference. Rachel didn't drink hers. She couldn't swallow. She kept scanning the woods, watching Shadow, watching the light. Something didn't sit right. At exactly 7:21 p.m., as the sun dipped below the pine line and the air turned sharp with evening chill, Shadow froze. Rachel felt it in the leash like a jolt of static. The dog's body stiffened, head tilted. And then, without warning, he lunged, straight into the tree line. "Shadow," she barked, boots kicking up wet earth as she chased him. Branches scratched at her arms and face, and the thorns of briar bushes tore at her sleeves. He didn't stop, didn't slow. They ran nearly a quarter mile through underbrush, over an old barbed wire fence long rusted out, and finally into a dark patch of forest where the trees grew so close together they blotted out the sky. That's when he started digging. If you're the kind of person who believes in brave dogs, real heroes, and stories that matter, hit subscribe on our YouTube channel, Brave Animals. Every story we tell honors the quiet courage of animals who don't give up. Rachel dropped to her knees beside Shadow. He was throwing dirt back in frantic waves, tail-stiff chest rumbling. Something glinted beneath the soil, a flash of plastic. Rachel's breath caught. She pushed Shadow gently aside, digging with her gloved hands. The smell of mud pine sap and something faintly sweet hit her hard. Then the shape came into view. A pink backpack, soaked through, mud-caked, but unmistakably a child's, with a faded Hello Kitty patch stitched near the zipper. She unzipped it slowly. Inside was a half-eaten peanut butter cracker pack, a bottle of water still sealed, and at the bottom, a crumpled piece of folded paper. It was a drawing, childlike with shaky crayon lines. One figure, a girl with brown ponytail and a pink dress, stood next to a taller, shadowy figure drawn all in black. The taller figure had no face. The child figure had tears drawn on. Rachel swallowed hard. She looked around. No blood, no clothes, no Emily. Just this buried evidence. Someone had tried to hide this. 10 minutes later, the scene was taped off. Flashlights cut through the dim woods as the sheriff and the search team arrived. "This wasn't dropped," he said, inspecting the disturbed soil. "Someone dug a shallow grave for her bag." Rachel nodded, her jaw tight. Shadow circled behind her, not sniffing, now pacing. He didn't sit. He didn't lie down. He wasn't finished. Let him go, the sheriff said. See where he leads. Rachel unclipped the leash. Shadow bolted again deeper into the woods. Rachel followed heart-pounding flashlights slicing through the dark. She couldn't stop thinking about the drawing. Why bury the backpack? Why leave the crackers? Why the crying girl and the faceless Shadow? The dog knew more. He always did. And as Shadow vanished ahead, weaving between trees like a ghost, Rachel felt it in her bones. They were getting close, but not close enough. Not yet. And whatever had taken Emily Carter wasn't just hiding her. It was taunting them. Shadow moved like a ghost through the trees, barely making a sound. Rachel Monroe followed close behind, her boots slipping in the wet underbrush, flashlight beam bouncing across mossy roots and bramble. The forest around them was dense now, thicker than she remembered it being from her childhood hikes with her uncle. The trees here weren't just tall. They leaned in as if they were eavesdropping. She hated that thought. The trail Shadow carved wasn't a trail at all. It was instinct. Raw, trained, deliberate. He wasn't guessing. His nose was locked onto something invisible to human senses. Rachel's breath came fast. Not from exertion, but from the weight of what they'd found. A pink backpack, buried. A drawing of a faceless figure looming over a crying girl. Emily, and someone else. The night air pressed in colder than it should have been for early October. Somewhere behind them, the search team was still combing the trailhead. The command tent had floodlights and maps and coffee. But out here, it was just them. About 100 yards past the spot where they'd found the backpack, Shadow halted. His nose hit the ground hard. He circled, ears twitching, and let out a low chuff. Rachel froze. There was no path here. No foot trail. Just leaf-covered ground, pine needles thick like carpet. Then she saw it, barely a flash under her light, a scrap of fabric clinging to a thorn bush. She knelt, gloved hand reaching out. It was a ribbon, bright yellow, torn and dirty. She recognized it immediately from the photos the parents had given them. Emily had been wearing that ribbon in her ponytail when she left for school. But what Rachel couldn't explain was how the ribbon had gotten 8 feet off the ground, tangled in high branches. Emily was small, barely 4 feet tall. There was no way she could have tossed it up there. And the bush below was scratched, as if something or someone had brushed against it at force. A sinking feeling settled in Rachel's stomach. Shadow, she whispered, but the dog had already moved again. They crossed a small creek, just enough to wet Rachel's boots and make her teeth grit. Shadow paused, sniffed at the bank, then doubled back a few feet and darted uphill. Rachel's flashlight flickered. She slapped the side, coaxing the battery. She didn't have time for darkness. Shadow stopped again, this time at a small clearing surrounded by tall pines. The earth here was undisturbed, no signs of digging, but the smell must have still lingered. Shadow began to whine, low, almost mournful. Rachel approached cautiously, scanning the area. At first she saw nothing. Then her light caught something small, half buried under leaves. A plastic charm. She knelt, brushed away the dirt. It was a keychain, a tiny pink unicorn with a cracked horn. Emily's name was printed in faint glitter letters along the side. It had broken from her bag, or it had been torn off. She closed her hand around it and stood slowly, turning in place. The woods here didn't feel like the rest of Brookvale. It wasn't just quiet, it was heavy. Like the silence had mass. A twig snapped behind her. Rachel spun, heart in her throat, hand hovering over her sidearm. Nothing. Just forest. Just night. But Shadow growled. Low. Untrusting. Rachel turned back toward him. His ears were pinned and his body tense. Not toward the trees, but down toward the ground. Then he began to dig again. Not with the frantic energy from before. This was slower, deliberate, focused. Rachel dropped beside him. What is it, boy? Her fingers brushed cold metal. She pulled it free, dirt crumbling from the edges. It was an old flashlight, faded green, heavy, military style. She clicked it on. Nothing. Dead. But there was something smeared on the side. She brought it closer to her light. A single word scratched in with something sharp. Help. The item was bagged immediately and Rachel radioed it in, but her gut was tight. Something didn't add up. Too many clues, all too perfectly spaced. It felt like they were being led. Shadow remained alert, pacing. He kept glancing toward the north ridge. Rachel knew what lay that way. Nothing but old hunting cabins and rocky drop-offs. No trails. No cell service. But dogs didn't lie. She whistled softly. Let's go. They climbed for nearly 40 minutes. The terrain got steeper and Rachel could feel the cold settling into her knees. At the top of the ridge, the trees opened into a wide, flat space. Moonlight spilled through broken cloud cover, revealing something she didn't expect. An old wooden structure. It looked like a shed, or maybe a root cellar partially collapsed on one side, covered in ivy and leaves. The door was ajar, leaning off its hinge. Shadow crept toward it, tail low nose, working overtime. Rachel's flashlight revealed rusted hinges, mold on the wood, and dark scratches near the handle. Deep scratches. Too high up to be a raccoon. Too low to be a bear. She drew her weapon and stepped carefully toward the entrance. "Sheriff's Department," she called out. "If anyone's in there, identify yourself now." Silence. Shadow sniffed along the frame, then darted around the far side of the building. He barked once sharp. Rachel followed, gun still raised. Behind the structure, hidden beneath overgrowth, was a cellar door, low iron banded, with a rotted lock barely hanging on. Shadow pawed at it, then looked up at her, whining. She knelt and tugged it open. A stale smell hit her, immediately dirt rot, mildew, cold air from below ground. Her light stabbed into the darkness. Stairs. Going down. Rachel didn't go in, not yet. She marked the spot, left a radio beacon, and called for backup. Whatever this place was, it hadn't been empty for long. Back at the command post, the sheriff reviewed her findings. "You're saying someone walked this kid half a mile through woods, buried her backpack, left her ribbon in a tree, planted a keychain, and dropped a flashlight with a cry for help. And it all leads to an abandoned cellar." "I'm saying it wasn't random," Rachel said quietly. "It feels like someone wanted to buy time. Maybe even to play games." The sheriff rubbed his temples. "We've had crazies before, but not like this." Rachel looked out the tent flap toward the woods. Shadow sat at the edge of the tree line, staring into the darkness. Not barking, not resting, just waiting. Like he knew the girl wasn't far now, and that time was running out. Rachel Monroe didn't sleep that night. Not really. She closed her eyes for 20 minutes in the back of the sheriff's SUV, head against the cold glass boots still caked in forest mud. Shadow lay beside her, quiet but watchful. He didn't rest either. Neither of them could. That cellar, half buried in leaves and time, kept pressing in on her brain like a weight she couldn't shake. The flashlight with help scratched into its side. The ribbon in the tree. The drawing of the faceless figure. It didn't add up to one person's careless mistake. It felt deliberate. Like someone was creating a trail of breadcrumbs, and Rachel wasn't sure if it was meant to be followed or meant to confuse. By dawn, the backup team had arrived. Forensics, search and rescue. A few federal agents flown in quietly under the radar. No press. The department wasn't about to stir up a media circus, not yet. Not until they knew what they were dealing with. Rachel sipped burnt gas station coffee and walked back toward the cellar site with Shadow trotting beside her. The forest looked different in daylight, less haunted, but it didn't feel safer. The cellar was deeper than they thought. 17 concrete steps, cracked and mossy, leading down to a narrow dirt chamber. Wooden shelves lined one side, filled with rusted cans, broken glass jars, and something that looked like a child's rain boot from the 90s. There was a mattress, old, stained, flattened like it had been slept on far too long. And something else. A rusted camping stove, empty juice boxes, crayon drawings taped to the wall. Rachel stood in the center of the space, flashlight sweeping across the drawings. They were shaky, clumsy, the kind only a child could make. But they weren't Emily's. The name Sarah was written on several of them, and the date in the corner of one read March 2007. "Looks like this place was used before," one of the federal agents muttered, crouching near the mattress. "At least once. Maybe more." "Somebody kept kids here," Rachel said, voice flat. The agent nodded. "Not just one." Shadow was tense again. He wasn't sniffing like before. He was standing perfectly still, tail stiff, nose lifted slightly as if reading the air. Rachel followed his gaze toward the back wall of the cellar. A faint outline was visible, bricks. Different from the others, newer, poorly mortared. She stepped closer, pressed her hand against it. It was hollow. The wall came down easier than expected. Bricks crumbled like sand under a pry bar. Behind them, a tunnel, narrow, dug by hand. The kind of space no adult could comfortably walk through, but a child could crawl it. Rachel's heart beat faster. "Flashlights," she said. "Let's go." The tunnel extended 30 feet. At the end of it, another chamber, smaller, colder. And in the middle of the room, a single wooden chair, straps on the arms. A camera mounted in the corner, rusted but clearly once used. The walls were covered in foam padding. Rachel didn't speak. She couldn't. Behind her, one of the agents whispered, "What the hell kind of place is this?" Rachel turned away before her stomach betrayed her. They shut it down. Photos, evidence bags, concrete samples. The entire area was now officially a crime scene. But Rachel's focus was still on Shadow, who had returned to pacing, this time in tight circles. He kept returning to a particular tree stump near the ridge, sniffing around its roots. She followed, knelt, and saw something wedged between two stones. A small plastic bracelet, pink, the kind you buy in a pack of 12 at Walmart. She pulled it out gently. "Emily," she whispered. Inside the bracelet, a name was scratched in with pen. "Mommy loves you." She bagged it immediately. "Whatever happened," she muttered to Shadow, she made it this far. Back at the station, Rachel laid out the clues like puzzle pieces on the table in the conference room. Sheriff Wallace stood behind her, arms crossed. "4 kids have gone missing in the past 15 years in a 40-mile radius," he said quietly. "All under age 10, all female. No bodies, no suspects." He pointed at the drawings from the cellar. "Sarah, she disappeared in 2007. Rachel nodded. "And whoever took her might still be out there." Wallace rubbed his face with both hands. "Jesus." Rachel gestured to Shadow, who was curled beside her chair, alert. "He's not finished. He knows there's more." Wallace looked at her. "You think Emily's still alive?" Rachel didn't blink. "I know she is." At 2:14 p.m., a woman burst through the front doors of the station, breathless and red-faced. She clutched a crumpled flyer of Emily's photo. "I found something in my backyard," she gasped. "You need to come, please. It's weird I didn't think it meant anything until I saw this." Her name was Margaret Latimer, retired nurse, lived 3 miles south of the woods. Small house near the old tracks. She led Rachel and Shadow to the edge of her property behind the shed. There, buried shallow in the garden bed, was a child's drawing, partially torn, water damaged. But the image was clear. A girl with a ponytail sitting on the ground. Behind her, a man with a dark, scribbled face. And to the left, a dog. Clearly drawn, clearly intentional. Rachel held the paper tight. "She drew Shadow," she whispered. Margaret blinked. "Is that the dog you've been using in the search?" Rachel nodded slowly. She saw him. Now the timeline was clearer. Emily had been alive recently, and she'd been moved, likely from the cellar, possibly to somewhere new. But she knew Shadow was close, and she left a sign. That kind of message wasn't random. It was hope. Rachel stood up straighter. "She's trying to help us," she said. "She's not just surviving, she's fighting." Margaret put a hand to her chest. "Will you find her?" Rachel didn't hesitate. "We have to." That evening, Rachel sat alone in her office watching old case files. 4 missing girls, 4 cold cases. Only one had left behind a drawing. Until now. And Shadow, he had never once followed a dead trail. He always followed life. Outside, the wind shifted. Rachel opened the window slightly, letting the scent of pine and distant autumn fires in. Shadow lifted his head. And for the first time all day, he barked. There were certain smells that Shadow never ignored. Blood, fear, sweat clinging to panic, the scent of a child's tears. But this was something different, something that made the fur along his spine rise. Deputy Rachel Monroe watched as her K-9 partner stood at the edge of the woods behind the Latimer property. Nose lifted, body trembling, not with fear, but with the kind of tension she'd only seen during bomb drills or high-risk trackings. "What do you have, boy?" she whispered, her fingers tightening on the leash. Shadow didn't answer with a bark or a pull. He did something far more unsettling. He backed away. Rachel stared into the woods. They were familiar but not friendly. Sunlight filtered through the branches, weak and watery. The wind shifted again, and this time she caught the faintest trace of it. Bleach, mixed with something sour and metallic. She took a slow breath, then unlatched Shadow's leash. He didn't bolt, he crept. Like whatever was in those trees wasn't running, it was waiting. The path wound tighter than she remembered from the property maps. Not even a deer trail. Just an overgrown stretch of broken ferns and scattered trash, a rusted bike frame, beer cans, a deflated football. Then Shadow veered sharply left, leading her through a thicket of saplings and down a shallow ravine. At the bottom was a clearing, ringed by fallen trees and rotting lumber. Rachel recognized it instantly. "Old Wilson's place," she murmured. The Wilson property had been foreclosed a decade ago, the farmhouse condemned, after a storm took off half the roof. Locals said it was haunted or cursed or both. But no one had lived here in years, at least not legally. The air changed as she stepped closer. More bleach, more rot. Shadow crouched low, hackles raised. His eyes were locked on the side of the house, specifically a basement window, barely above ground level. The glass was grimy. The curtains behind it were drawn shut. Rachel crept forward and knelt beside the window. Then she saw it. A fingerprint. Small. left in the grime on the inside of the pane. And next to it, scrawled in the foggy condensation, was a smeared heart shape, like a child had pressed her finger and drawn it from inside. Her throat went dry. She circled around the back of the house, shadow glued to her side. The back door had a heavy padlock, newer than the rest of the structure. No way someone accidentally left that on a condemned home. This was planned. This was active. She called it in immediately. "Sheriff, I've got possible signs of movement at the Wilson property. I need backup now." Quietly, no sirens. "You got eyes on the girl?" the sheriff asked. "Not yet, but she's close. I can feel it." She hung up. And then Shadow growled. The sound came from inside, faint footsteps overhead, moving across warped floorboards. Rachel pressed herself against the siding and motioned Shadow down. A silhouette moved past the far window. Too tall for a child. Muffled, slow, deliberate. Whoever it was, he wasn't trying to hide. He knew someone was there. Rachel's pulse quickened. She drew her weapon, but she didn't move in yet. Shadow whined low. His paw scraped gently at the ground near the basement window. Rachel followed his gaze, then crouched. There was something else scratched into the dirt. Letters. Just one word carved in with a stick or a rock. Under. By the time the backup team arrived, Rachel had already marked 2 potential entry points, the side basement door and a crawl space vent behind the shed. The sheriff nodded as he approached, his face pale. "You sure she's in there?" Rachel didn't hesitate. "She's alive, and she's not alone." They split into 2 teams, one to breach from the back, one to cover the front. Rachel and Shadow took the side basement. The door opened easier than expected. No traps, no creaks, just the slow, heavy groan of hinges tired from disuse. Inside, it was worse than she feared. The air was thick with mold and cleaner, and something almost sweet. The basement was lined with plywood walls, cheap and freshly installed, like someone had built makeshift rooms down here. Rachel moved cautiously, gun-raised flashlight slicing through the dark. Then she heard it, a soft whimper. She turned to the left and saw a mattress on the floor, blankets, juice boxes, crayons, and in the corner behind a small wooden partition, Emily. The child blinked up at her, eyes wide and red-rimmed. Dirt smudged her cheeks and her ribbon was gone, but it was her, very much alive. Rachel holstered her weapon instantly and dropped to her knees. "Emily, it's okay, sweetie. I'm Rachel. I'm here to take you home." Emily didn't speak. She looked past Rachel to Shadow. Then she smiled, a tiny trembling smile. "I heard him," she whispered. "I knew you'd come." Rachel scooped her into her arms just as the sheriff's voice crackled through the radio. "We've got a runner, male suspect, heading north from the 2nd floor. Repeat, on foot." Rachel handed Emily to one of the medics waiting outside and turned toward Shadow. "Find him," she said, and Shadow ran. The chase was fast and brutal. The man, early 40s, jeans, gray hoodie, scruffy beard, sprinted through the trees like he'd been preparing for this moment. But Shadow was faster. He cut off angles, drove the man toward the ravine, and when the suspect slipped and tumbled, Rachel was there, weapon trained, breath ragged. "Don't move." He looked up, eyes wild. "You don't understand. She was safe with me." Rachel's finger tightened on the trigger. "You buried her backpack in the woods. You strapped her to a chair in a concrete pit. That's not safety." "She was chosen," he muttered. "She saw things. They always do." Shadow growled low and rumbling. Rachel cuffed him hard. "I don't care what you think she saw," she said. "She's going home." Back at the station, Emily was given warm clothes, water, and a nurse who spoke softly and didn't push. Her parents arrived an hour later, weeping. Emily didn't cry. She just clung to her mother, tiny fingers fisted in the fabric of her shirt. Rachel watched from the hallway. She felt exhausted, but not empty. Shadow lay beside her feet, finally calm. The little girl had lived, and the man who'd taken her along with 3 others over the past 15 years was behind bars. But what still haunted Rachel was something Emily had whispered before she left. He said he wasn't the only one. Rachel Monroe had been in law enforcement long enough to know when something didn't end with an arrest. The man they brought in, Clayton Pierce, 44, former truck mechanic, quiet neighbor, no prior record, fit the profile on paper. Too clean, too normal. But it was Emily Carter's words that clung to Rachel like pine sap. He said he wasn't the only one. It wasn't just a warning. It was a roadmap. 3 days after Emily was found, the sheriff's office was still buzzing. Forensics flooded the old Wilson property. The basement, the makeshift rooms, the camera mounts. Every inch was cataloged, photographed, and pulled apart. But what nobody expected was what lay underneath it all. It was a rookie from State Patrol who spotted it first, a strange depression in the dirt behind the shed. a place where the soil didn't match the rest of the yard. Softer, loose. Rachel stood over the patch arms crossed shadow sitting beside her. You thinking what I'm thinking? She asked. The sheriff just nodded. We dig. They brought in shovels and started slow. 10 inches down, they hit stone. Not random, not a boulder. It was laid stone flat, uniform fitted. And in the center, a metal ring. Rachel knelt, brushed the dirt away with gloved hands, and pulled. A square stone slab lifted from the ground with a groan, revealing a dark hole beneath. The air that rushed out was cold, stale, and wrong. It smelled like mildew, plastic, and something beneath it all like old tears soaked into concrete. Someone built this, one of the agents muttered. A long time ago. Rachel turned to Shadow. Go slow. And then they descended. The space below was narrow, just enough room to crouch. The walls were damp, old stone mortared crudely. Every step echoed in the silence. They followed the passage 30 feet before it opened into a larger chamber. Rachel's flashlight swept across the room, and what she saw made her blood turn to ice. The walls were lined with drawings, hundreds of them. Crayons, markers, some scribbled in pencil, all childlike. Stick figures, big shadowy shapes, crying eyes, cages. Some were just words written over and over. Sorry, yeah, please, don't take me. In the center of the room stood a wooden chair bolted to the floor. Leather straps hung from its arms, cracked and stained. To the left, an old plastic bin filled with stuffed animals. Some were moldy. Others were clearly new. To the right, shelves of VHS tapes labeled by name and date. Rachel's hands clenched. This wasn't just Pierce, she said. One of the feds walked over with a flashlight, his voice low. We ran his financials. There were payments, monthly deposits coming from an untraceable third party. Cash converted to digital. Always the same day each month. Rachel didn't move, so he was being paid. For what the sheriff asked, though the answer was already plain. For access, Rachel said. Her voice was colder than the stone around them. Shadow began to growl. Low, deep, focused. Rachel turned fast. His nose was pressed to a gap in the far wall. A draft came through it, barely noticeable unless you stood right in front of it. Rachel pressed her hand to the wall, a faint vibration. She stepped back and tapped along the edge. Hollow. Another door. They forced it open using a crowbar. Behind it lay a tunnel slightly wider than the first. The air was different, warmer somehow. More used. Someone's been here recently, Rachel muttered. The tunnel stretched nearly 50 yards before ending in another room. This one was more modern. Cinder block walls, a generator, an old folding cot, a mini fridge, and maps. Dozens of maps pinned to a corkboard, each marked with red pins, each with a child's photo taped beside it. Rachel walked up slowly. Her fingers hovered over one particular pin marked Evansville, Indiana. The name beside it read Maya R., the date 03/12/2011. She scanned the board. 10 states, 18 children, different cities, different years. And then at the bottom of the board, Durna de Renesserie de Mary. A new pin, Brookvale. Emily C. 10-5, intake complete. Rachel's stomach turned. They'd interrupted something in progress. The rest of the room confirmed it. Invoices, names, code numbers, a burner phone, files labeled by age group. It wasn't just Pierce. It was a system. He wasn't the predator. He was a supplier. And Emily wasn't the first. She'd barely escaped becoming the next. Back at the station, Rachel laid it out for the team. Clayton Pierce had been recruited likely years ago by an underground trafficking ring that targeted small towns with low media attention. He was paid to isolate, hold, and prepare children for handoff. Emily had been his latest, but something had gone wrong. She drew shadow, Rachel reminded them. She saw him. She knew she had to leave signs. She saved herself, the sheriff said quietly. Rachel nodded. She bought herself time, and she led us to all of this. News didn't break for another week. The feds asked for silence, no leaks, no press. They wanted to work through the web first, track every payment, every drop-off point, every pin on that map. But Rachel couldn't sleep. She kept going back to that room of drawings, the ones taped to the walls, the ones scrawled in terror and pain. There were too many names, too many forgotten faces. And then came the call. Another fingerprint had been lifted from the plastic bin in the underground room. It matched a child who went missing in Arkansas in 2006, a girl who was declared dead in 2015. But the DNA swab recovered from the basement mattress proved she'd been alive much longer than anyone knew. And they still hadn't found her. Rachel stared at the evidence board late that night, fingers gripping a photo of Emily. She looked back at Shadow, curled on the floor like always. You found her, she whispered. The dog's ears twitched. But someone else is still out there. More than one. Shadow stood slowly and faced the door. Rachel followed his gaze. Because even with one monster behind bars, the hunt wasn't over. For a moment, Rachel Monroe thought it was over. Clayton Pierce was behind bars. Emily was home safe in her mother's arms. The tunnels beneath the Wilson property had been sealed, cataloged, and handed over to federal jurisdiction. And Shadow, her loyal K9 partner, was back to napping on his favorite spot in the corner of the station's hallway, ears twitching in his sleep like he was still chasing ghosts in the woods. But peace in Brookvale didn't feel peaceful. It felt unfinished. It started with a knock on her office door. Sheriff Wallace stepped in holding a thin manila folder. "We got a match," he said. "From the bin. The toys in the chamber." Rachel sat up straighter. "Another child. 3 actually," Wallace said, his voice rough. "And one of them's recent, as in within the past year. From right here in Missouri. Name's Lila Dunn. Disappeared from the edge of town 8 months ago." Rachel opened the folder. The little girl stared up at her from the photo. Blonde hair, blue eyes, missing one front tooth. "She wasn't listed on Pierce's board," Rachel muttered. "That's because she didn't come through him," Wallace said. "Which means we've got more players in this game than we thought." Rachel glanced toward the hallway, where Shadow had just stood up and wandered to her door. His nose was in the air. "She's still alive," she whispered. "I can feel it." Shadow whined. And in that moment, Rachel knew. They weren't done yet. The investigation picked up again, silent, careful. The feds were watching accounts, traffic, strange purchases. They followed a trail of burner phones, cash-only supply stores, and unlisted storage units. But it was Shadow who cracked the next lead. 3 days later, on a foggy Thursday morning, Rachel drove out to an abandoned veterinary clinic 20 minutes south of town. The building had been sold at auction 2 years ago, but hadn't changed hands on paper. Locals said they sometimes saw lights on late at night. Rachel had brought Shadow along more for comfort than anything. But the moment she pulled into the gravel lot, his body tensed. He leapt from the truck before she could call his name, paused, digging into the dirt, and ran. "Shadow," she called, heart spiking. He didn't hesitate. He darted around back, nose pressed, low tail stiff like a pointer. Rachel followed. Behind the clinic was a narrow strip of woods. Not deep, but wild, unkept. Shadow paced back and forth, whining, then zeroed in on a patch of earth near the tree line. He began to dig. Rachel knelt beside him, brushing dirt aside with her hands. A small wooden plank came into view, weathered, rotten at the corners. She tugged it up. Beneath it, a trapdoor. "Sheriff," she said into the radio, breath tight, "I think we've got another one." This room was smaller, cleaner. The walls were dry, covered in old soundproofing panels. There were no chairs, no straps. But there were drawings. Fresh ones, and a backpack with a name tag, Lila D. Rachel's eyes burned. "She's here," she said. "She was just here." Shadow barked once. He'd moved toward a wall with loose paneling. Behind it, a narrow tunnel. Still fresh. The dirt hadn't even settled yet. They called in backup. 2 hours later, a farmhouse was raided just 6 miles east. Inside, they found Lila. Alive, cold, clutching a small stuffed bunny with one ear missing. She didn't cry. But when Rachel knelt and introduced herself, the girl looked past her, at Shadow. "You're the dog," she said, from the other girl's drawing. Rachel's heart caught. Emily had drawn Shadow, and Lila had seen the drawing pass between girls in captivity. "Shadow found you," Rachel said gently. Lila smiled, and for the first time, Rachel let herself cry. The arrest came quickly after that. 2 more men in neighboring counties. 1 woman, a nurse with forged IDs. It was a ring just like they feared. Not big, not flashy, but efficient, mobile, operating under the radar. And thanks to Emily, Lila, and the path Shadow had followed, it was over. 3 weeks later, Rachel stood on the courthouse steps as reporters asked their questions. She gave them what she could. Yes, the operation was local. Yes, multiple suspects had been identified. Yes, the children were safe. But what she didn't say was what haunted her most. How close it all had come to disappearing. How easily these kids could have vanished without a trace. If not for a backpack, if not for a girl's courage, if not for a dog who refused to stop sniffing. Emily's recovery was slow but steady. Her mother sent Rachel handwritten notes every week. Updates, photos, small victories. She's talking again. She asked to draw today. She's not afraid of the woods anymore. One afternoon, Rachel returned to her desk to find a package. Inside was a drawing, stick figures, crayons. 1 girl with a ponytail, 1 tall woman with short brown hair, and 1 big dog with a fluffy tail. underneath a single line in careful handwriting. I'm brave now, just like Shadow. Rachel framed it on the wall of the station. Not in the trophy room, not in the evidence locker, but just outside the front door so every officer who walked in would see it first. They say every town has its ghosts. Brookville had its fair share, but it also had its guardians. Some wore badges, some carried radios, and some, like Shadow, didn't need words to save lives. They just needed the scent of one scared child and the chance to follow it all the way home. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey through the muddy backpack beneath the pines. We hope it reminded you that real heroes come in all shapes and sometimes four legs. We'd love to hear from you. What part of this story moved you the most? And do you believe animals like Shadow truly sense more than we do? Let us know in the comments.